Let's start with something that might make you a little uncomfortable and slowly work our way towards the absolutely horrifying cases that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. You know how sometimes you'll be scrolling through social media at 2 in the morning and you'll stumble across some random historical fact that makes you go, wait, that actually happened? Well, buckle up because we're about to dive into some witch trials that are so disturbing, so bizarre, and so completely messed up that they make the Salem witch trials look like a casual book club meeting. See, here's the thing about history that nobody really talks about. We all learned about Salem in school, right? Bunch of girls start acting weird, people get accused, some folks get hanged, everyone feels bad about it later. Classic American history lesson. But what they don't tell you is that Salem was just the tip of the iceberg. There were witch trials happening all over the world that were so much worse, so much more twisted, and involved methods of torture that would make medieval executioners say, whoa, maybe we should dial it back a notch. I've spent weeks digging through dusty historical records, old court documents, and eyewitness accounts that have been buried for centuries. Some of this stuff is so disturbing that historians barely talk about it. But today, we're going to shine a light on 5 witch trials that will completely change how you think about human nature and what people are capable of when fear takes over. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to understand why these stories have been kept quiet for so long. But first, let me ask you something. What's the worst punishment you can imagine for someone you genuinely believed was in league with the devil? Keep that thought in mind, because I guarantee you, it's not as creative as what actually happened. Let's kick things off with a case that happened in 1590 in Scotland, during what historians now call the North Berwick witch trials. Now, you might think you know where this is going, but trust me, you don't. This wasn't just about some random accusations flying around a small village. This was a full-blown conspiracy theory that reached all the way up to King James I himself. Picture this. The king is trying to sail to Denmark to pick up his new bride, but every time his ships try to leave, they get hit by these absolutely massive storms. We're talking biblical-level weather that keeps sinking his fleet. Now, any reasonable person might think, hey, maybe we should check the weather forecast next time. But King James had a different theory. He was convinced that witches were literally controlling the weather to prevent his marriage. So what does he do? He orders the arrest of over 100 people in the North Berwick area. Men, women, elderly folks, teenagers, didn't matter. If someone pointed a finger at you and said you were making it rain, you were getting dragged to court. But here's where it gets really messed up. The king didn't just want confessions. He wanted details. He wanted names. He wanted to know exactly how these people were supposedly controlling the weather. The torture methods they used to extract these confessions were beyond anything you've probably heard of. They had something called the pillowinks, which were basically thumb screws that would slowly crush your fingers until the bones shattered. Then there were the boots, iron contraptions that would be placed around your legs and gradually tightened until your leg bones cracked like twigs. But the worst part? They had this thing called the branks, also known as the scold's bridle. It was a metal cage that went over your head with an iron spike that would pierce your tongue if you tried to speak. The accused would be forced to wear these for days while being questioned, unable to eat, drink, or defend themselves properly. One woman, named Gillis Duncan, was accused of being the ringleader of this weather-controlling coven. They tortured her for months, trying to get her to name other witches. When the thumb screws didn't work fast enough, they started pulling out her fingernails with pliers. When that wasn't enough, they began using red-hot iron rods to burn symbols into her skin. The crazy part is that people actually started confessing to controlling the weather. Can you imagine being in so much pain that you'd admit to something that's literally impossible just to make it stop? Gillis Duncan eventually confessed to sailing across the North Sea in a sieve with other witches to cast spells on the king's ships. A sieve, like the thing you use to strain pasta. But wait, it gets worse. The confessions started getting more and more elaborate. People were claiming they held meetings with the devil himself in a local church. They said they dug up corpses to use in their spells. They admitted to poisoning wells and causing livestock to die. All complete nonsense, but the authorities ate it up like it was gospel truth. The king was so convinced that he personally attended some of the torture sessions. He would sit there and watch as people had their bones broken and their flesh burned, taking notes like he was attending a university lecture. This is the same King James who commissioned the famous King James Bible, by the way. Really makes you think about the duality of human nature, doesn't it? Over 70 people were eventually executed in the North Berwick trials. They were burned alive, which was considered the proper way to deal with witches since fire was supposed to purify their souls. But here's the kicker. The storms that started this whole mess, they were just normal Scottish weather. Scotland is literally one of the stormiest places in Europe. It rains there like it's going out of style. So King James ordered the deaths of 70 innocent people because he didn't understand meteorology. And this isn't even close to being the most disturbing case we're going to cover today. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's pretty messed up, but at least it was just one crazy king, right? Wrong. This kind of thing was happening everywhere, and some of the methods used were so creative in their cruelty that they'd make the Spanish Inquisition look like a spa day. Let me tell you about what happened in Würzburg, Germany, between 1626 and 1631. This case is so disturbing that even hardened historians have trouble talking about it without getting visibly uncomfortable. The Prince Bishop of Würzburg, Julius Ector, had died, and his successor, Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim, decided that his diocese was absolutely crawling with witches. But this wasn't your typical witch hunt where they'd grab a few suspected practitioners and call it a day. No, this guy went completely nuclear on his own population. Von Dornheim was convinced that witches had infiltrated every level of society. We're talking about judges, priests, nobles, merchants, children as young as 7 years old, and even his own nephew. Nobody was safe from accusation, and the methods they used to extract confessions were so systematically brutal that they basically turned torture into an art form. They built a special prison called the Malefice, which translates to the House of Evil. This wasn't just a regular jail where they'd throw you in a cell and forget about you. This place was specifically designed for maximum psychological and physical torment. The building had multiple floors, each one dedicated to different types of torture equipment. On the ground floor, they had what they called the strappado. Victims would have their hands tied behind their backs, then hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. The weight of their own body would dislocate their shoulders, but that was just the warm-up. They'd drop you suddenly, jerking the rope tight just before you hit the ground, which would tear your shoulder joints completely apart. The second floor housed the rack, but not the kind you've seen in movies. This was a modified version that could stretch a human body until their joints separated and their spine elongated to the point where victims would grow several inches taller. The operators were so skilled at this that they could keep someone alive on the rack for hours, gradually increasing the tension while asking questions about other supposed witches. But the third floor, that's where things got truly nightmarish. They had something called the Iron Maiden, which wasn't actually used that much historically. But in Würzburg, they perfected it. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. The spikes inside were positioned so they'd pierce non-vital organs first, causing maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious for interrogation. Here's what makes the Würzburg trials especially disturbing. They kept detailed records. We're talking about meticulous documentation of every single torture session, every confession, every execution. These weren't random acts of violence driven by mob hysteria. This was organized, systematic elimination of the population. The confessions they extracted were absolutely insane. People were admitting to flying through the air on goats, having intimate relationships with demons, and attending massive witch gatherings where hundreds of people would dance naked with Satan himself. They confessed to causing specific crop failures, naming exact dates and locations. They admitted to murdering children by looking at them the wrong way. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a boy named Johannes Junius, who was the nephew of the Prince Bishop himself. This kid was maybe 12 years old when they arrested him for witchcraft. They tortured him for weeks, trying to get him to confess that his own uncle was also a witch. Can you imagine the family dynamics there? Your uncle is literally ordering your torture to get you to implicate him in devil worship. The boy held out longer than most adults, but eventually, after they started burning his feet with red-hot coals, he confessed to everything they wanted to hear. He said he'd been recruited into witchcraft by his own family members. He named dozens of other children as fellow witches. He claimed he'd attended Sabbats where they'd cooked and eaten babies. But here's the thing that'll really mess with your head. Johannes managed to smuggle out a letter from his prison cell right before his execution. In it, he explained exactly how the torture had worked, how they'd forced him to confess to things that never happened, and how the pain had become so unbearable that he would have said anything to make it stop. The letter survived, and historians found it centuries later, Reading his first-hand account of what they did to him is absolutely gut-wrenching. The Würzburg trials didn't just target the usual suspects like old women living alone or people who were different. They went after everyone: wealthy merchants, respected judges, Catholic priests, Protestant ministers, young mothers, elderly grandfathers. The bishop's own family members weren't safe. By the time it was all over, they'd executed over 600 people in just 5 years. 600 people, in a region that probably only had a few thousand residents total. They essentially depopulated entire villages. Children were left orphaned when both parents were burned as witches. Businesses collapsed when their owners were arrested. Churches stood empty because both the priests and the congregations had been executed. The economic impact was devastating, but von Dornheim didn't care. He was making money off the trials because convicted witches had their property seized by the church. Every execution meant more wealth flowing into his coffers. There's actually evidence that he deliberately targeted wealthy families because their confiscated estates would be more valuable. And the methods of execution weren't quick or merciful either. They didn't just burn people at the stake and call it done. They had this elaborate ritual where the condemned would be paraded through town while crowds threw stones and garbage at them. Then they'd be strapped to a wooden post, but instead of lighting the fire immediately, they'd start with small flames around the feet and gradually work their way up. The whole process could take hours, with the victim slowly roasting alive while the crowd watched and cheered. Sometimes they'd pause the burning partway through to ask if the person wanted to confess to additional crimes. If you said yes, they'd restart the torture sessions right there in public before finishing the execution. But even that's not the most disturbing part of the Würzburg trials. So there you have it, 5 witch trials that make Salem look like a neighborhood disagreement about fence lines. From King James torturing people because he couldn't read a weather report, to entire regions being systematically depopulated because someone thought their neighbor looked at them funny, these cases show us just how quickly civilization can completely fall apart when fear takes the wheel. The scariest part isn't the torture devices or the ridiculous confessions or even the massive death tolls. It's how normal, rational people convince themselves that all of this was not only justified, but necessary. These weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches while cackling about evil plans. These were judges, priests, kings, and everyday citizens who genuinely believed they were saving their communities from supernatural threats. And here's what really keeps me up at night. This stuff didn't happen in some distant, primitive era when people didn't know any better. Some of these trials were happening at the same time as the Renaissance, when humans were creating incredible art and making scientific discoveries. We're talking about societies that could build magnificent cathedrals and write beautiful poetry, but could also convince themselves that a 12-year-old boy was flying around on a goat making crops fail. Makes you wonder what future generations are going to think about some of the things we do today, doesn't it? But hey, that's a topic for another video. If you made it this far, you're clearly as fascinated by humanity's dark side as I am, so make sure you subscribe because we've got plenty more disturbing historical rabbit holes to dive down together.